This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, in our series on continuity and change in the Old Testament, we pause to get ourselves an orientation. We look at what I call the big picture. Last week, we covered the primeval history, which really isn't history, and it's really not even on a timeline. And that's why I've drawn a circle here, because it is structured in a completely different way. And so in this primeval history, much of it is built on the structure of the world as a closed firmament with pillars upon which the firmament exists, where people then dwell. There then is the firmament above, and everything is really about order and structure, challenged by the problem of death. What we see in this is the great disruption in this period of the flood and the introduction of the concept of covenant. Then we have a radical break with this primeval history at the scene of Babel, where then, instead of Babel, which is another offense to the order, instead of it leading to a flood and to death, instead we have a break into what we would call history. And so we can imagine now a timeline moving forward. And the timeline that they will then see for the remainder of the Old Testament, and indeed moving forward, can be structured in many ways, but a very helpful hermeneutical rubric to understand it is on one great litmus test: when they are in the land and when they are not in the land. And so we're going to do a quick overview of just some points in this narrative in order to get ourselves the big picture built on their dynamic understanding of land and themselves. So after the primeval history, we begin with Abram. And Abram begins not in the land, who then is told to go into the land. Now, he's sort of barely in the land theologically, because it is not a nation, it is not a political entity, it is a family. We have a family dynamic with Abraham, which is part of the whole concept of descent being so important, but it's structured around a concept we've had already, which is covenant. We in fact have 4 different expressions of the covenant with Abram, and then Abraham, of course, through one of the covenants. And this narrative will then continue through what we call the other patriarchal narratives, which is Isaac and Jacob. Jacob, by the way, the one who wrestles with God, also named Israel. And again, we are in a family structure. And then we get the introduction of Joseph. And Joseph changes this structure in that he brings, through the dynamic narrative of Joseph in the book of Genesis, brings the people out of the land into Egypt. And when Joseph brings them into Egypt, they are in the ruling class, but eventually end up in slavery in Egypt, leading to the introduction of Moses. And now, with the character of Moses, they are going to leave Egypt, and as they leave Egypt, they introduce a new concept on a mountain called Sinai. And at Sinai, they receive Torah, a completely new idea than they'd ever had before, that included ethics. How you treated one another mattered to God. There's always been ethics, but it wasn't always tied to religion. Now it is. And they also are now no longer a family, they're clearly a society. And then Moses does not bring them into the land. They end up in wilderness wanderings until we get the rise of Joshua and Judges, where they enter back into the land. Now, at this time, they are not an independent nation. What they are 12 tribes that are quite independent from one another, that unite around really just one worship site, which is at this time described as the tent of meeting. And so this tent and this worship site are what structures who they are. Then we have the rise of the king, higher on this side of the land, because of course, with the king, the land, they're starting to become a true nation. And here we have the characters of Saul, of David, of Solomon. And under this monarchy, they become a kingdom. And then we have the introduction again of something new with David, and then encapsulated with Solomon, which is another mountain, but this time Zion. Zion being the new capital and a special place wherein they felt God was reaching them, culminating in Solomon's building of the temple. And now they are a complete political entity that is completely tied to the space and land that they are in, leading to the question of how we relate to our God is through our capital, through our temple, through our Zion. And this will be the reality for a brief time period until we have the introduction of division. With Solomon's son Rehoboam, we have now 2 kingdoms. We have the 10 tribes in the south, or 10 tribes in the north, and the 2 in the south. The 2 are the ones connected to Zion, and we have a split history. And this split history is going to end up going in rather different ways, where in 721 BC, the 10 tribes are conquered by Assyria, taken into slavery, and lost. They become, as far as we know, a non-entity. Then we have the now kingdom of Judah, who is all there is and what is relating to Jerusalem, and they will work and live in this time period. This, by the way, is the period of the prophets. Early on, we have the period of Elijah and Elisha. Later on, during this split area, we start having figures like Isaiah. Then we lead all the way to the fall, and it's a fast fall, of Judah, structured around Jeremiah and other spaces, where in 586 BC, there's a more complicated history, but 586, finally, the temple is destroyed and the people are taken off into exile. There's a variety of difficult situations with that are complicated. But then in 539, they are allowed to come back into the land. I put that, though, as a dotted line because most people do not. We have the introduction of the concept of diaspora. Some people make it back to the land. Many others do not, and they live all over the earth. And now they have to learn, who are we? If here we were a society, here we were a kingdom, a nation, now we're no longer a nation. We have a new identity, which is going to have challenges, because while they were able to go back into the land, they did not rule the land. They were allowed to live there under Persian rule. And so we start having, what does it mean? And how do we relate with foreign influence? And what does even foreign influence mean? We start seeing adherence to Torah starts to be the focus and ideal. Even if you're living in the land, your religiosity might not have to do with the reconstructed temple. It might have to do with Torah, something you could do anywhere. We have the rise of a concept, the synagogue, something that could be anywhere. We have this question, how are we different? And we have differing opinions. We see, say, in the book of Jonah, written during this time, that you have others can have a relationship with God, but maybe not our relationship. Then you have the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, during this time, during when the return happens, where you have to get rid of all of these foreign marriages that you've had, and we have to be the only those who were with us through this whole journey. Or then you have the book of Ruth, also written during this time, which is, well, we in fact can have those who were foreign born into our group. And frankly, once they're in their group, they're not foreign born anymore. They're part of our group in and of themselves. We start having new speculation, such as questions of individual accountability rather than collective. So that tension starts to show up. This is a basic scheme of a lot of different questions that you're kind of left with. But as we see, this process has taken us on a rather striking journey, because however you date Abraham might be somewhere between 2100 and 1800 BC. Well, here we're at the very 539, and some of the last books would be written even later than that. We're dealing with almost 1,300 years of history. And so having this big picture helps us get a better sense of how it is God is relating to the people of God in the Old Testament over the duration of these 39 books. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.